The missile warning alarm screamed in my headset 3 seconds before the SA-2 surface-to-air missile hit my F-4 Phantom. I was flying at 18,000 feet over North Vietnam, had just completed a bombing run on a suspected supply depot near Hanoi, was climbing to rejoin my flight when the entire aircraft shuddered from the impact of a proximity-fused warhead that detonated 20 feet from my right wing. December 18, 1967. Airspace over Hanoi, North Vietnam. The controls went dead in my hands. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the canopy. Warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. Fire, hydraulic failure, engine failure. Every system simultaneously screaming that the aircraft was dying. Through the canopy I could see the right wing was shredded, burning, barely attached to the fuselage. We're hit. We're hit. Mayday, mayday. Falcon 2 is going down. My backseater, First Lieutenant Michael Connors, was already preparing for ejection. We had maybe 30 seconds before the aircraft became unflyable, before it entered an uncontrollable spin that would make ejection impossible. Eject, eject, eject. I transmitted, pulled the ejection handle. The explosive charge fired. The canopy blew off. The ejection seat rocketed me out of the disintegrating aircraft at 400 knots airspeed. The deceleration was violent. Felt like being hit by a truck. Every organ in my body compressed, vision tunneling from the G-forces. Then I was falling, tumbling through the air at 18,000 feet, watching my burning F-4 spiral downward, trailing smoke and flames. The ejection seat separated automatically. My parachute deployed with a violent jerk that felt like it was tearing my shoulders from their sockets. I was descending toward enemy territory, toward North Vietnam where downed American pilots were captured, imprisoned, tortured, toward 5 years of hell that would test every aspect of my physical and psychological endurance. My name is James Robert Patterson. I was 28 years old, an Air Force captain with 147 combat missions over North Vietnam. I'd grown up in Nebraska, joined the Air Force at 21, become an F-4 pilot because I wanted to fly the fastest, most capable fighter bomber in the world. I've been in Vietnam since April 1967, had 8 months of combat experience, thought I understood what war meant. I understood nothing. The real war, the war of survival as a prisoner, was about to begin. It would last 1,847 days. 5 years and 27 days of captivity in prisons where torture was routine, where psychological warfare was constant, where survival required adapting to conditions that broke most men who experienced them. This is the story of those 1,847 days. The story of what it meant to be a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. The story of torture, resistance, survival, and the brotherhood among prisoners that made endurance possible when individual willpower failed. Capture. I hit the ground in a rice paddy, maybe 6 miles north of Hanoi. Landed hard, rolled, got tangled in the parachute suspension lines. Before I could free myself, North Vietnamese militia were running toward me from a nearby village. Farmers carrying rifles and machetes, shouting in Vietnamese, clearly intent on capturing or killing the American pilot who just descended into their community. I raise my hands. I surrender. I'm a prisoner. Geneva Convention. I surrender. They didn't care about the Geneva Convention. They were angry. Their country was being bombed. Their families were threatened. And I represented the enemy who'd been killing their people for years. They hit me with rifle butts, kicked me while I was on the ground, stripped me of my survival gear and most of my flight suit, tied my hands behind my back with rope so tight it cut off circulation. A truck arrived, military, North Vietnamese Army regulars who took custody from the militia. They were more disciplined, but equally hostile. Blindfolded me, threw me in the back of the truck, drove for what felt like hours through Hanoi. I could hear the city sounds, traffic, people, the normal noise of urban life, while bound and blindfolded in the back of an enemy military vehicle. Finally, the truck stopped. I was dragged out, pushed through a doorway, down corridors, into a cell. The blindfold was removed. I was in a small room, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with concrete walls, a concrete sleeping platform, a bucket for waste, and nothing else. The door was solid wood with a small barred window. Guard faces appeared at that window constantly, watching, ensuring I couldn't escape or harm myself. This was Hoa Lo Prison, called the Hanoi Hilton by American prisoners because of how deliberately terrible the conditions were. Built by French colonials in the early 1900s to hold Vietnamese political prisoners, now used by North Vietnam to hold captured American pilots and soldiers. I've been a prisoner for maybe 3 hours. I had 1,846 days and 21 hours remaining before my release. But I didn't know that then. Sitting in that cell on December 18th, 1967, I had no idea how long captivity would last, whether I'd ever be released, whether I'd survive whatever the North Vietnamese intended to do to me. The door opened. A guard entered with an officer, clearly political officer based on his uniform and bearing. "You are criminal. You bomb innocent Vietnamese people. You will confess your crimes. You will apologize. You will cooperate. I am Captain James Patterson, United States Air Force. My service number is..." The political officer struck me across the face. "You are criminal. You have no rights. You will do what we say, or you will be punished severely." That was my introduction to captivity. The immediate establishment that I had no rights, that the Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war would not be honored, that my captors viewed me as a war criminal rather than a legitimate combatant deserving humane treatment. Over the next days, the pattern established itself. Interrogations demanding confessions, demands that I denounce American policy, demands that I provide intelligence about aircraft capabilities and targeting. When I refused, when I provided only name, rank, service number, and date of birth as required by the Code of Conduct for American prisoners, the punishment began. The rope torture. The torture room was small, windowless, stifling hot. I was forced to kneel with my hands tied behind my back. A guard wrapped rope around my arms above the elbows, began pulling the rope tighter, forcing my elbows together behind my back. The pain was immediate and excruciating, shoulders dislocating, chest compressed so breathing became difficult, circulation cut off to arms and hands. "You will confess. You will write statements saying you are a war criminal. You will apologize for bombing Vietnamese people." I refused, kept refusing even as the rope was tightened further. Even as the pain became so intense, I was screaming involuntarily. Even as I felt shoulders separating and ribs cracking from the pressure. The torture continued for hours. They'd tighten the ropes, leave me alone to suffer, return to demand confessions, tighten the ropes further when I refused. My arms went numb from lack of circulation. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I was hyperventilating from pain and inability to breathe properly. Finally, I broke. Couldn't endure anymore. Agreed to write whatever they wanted if they just stopped the torture. They removed the ropes. The return of circulation was almost as painful as the torture itself. Nerve damage causing electric shock sensations throughout my arms and chest. I couldn't move my arms for hours afterward. Couldn't feed myself. Couldn't perform basic functions. I wrote the confession they demanded. Lies about being a war criminal, about regretting my actions, about believing American policy was wrong. Wrote it because continuing to resist meant more torture I couldn't endure. The shame was crushing. I'd violated the Code of Conduct, had given the enemy propaganda material they'd use against America, had failed to resist as I'd been trained to do. But I also learned the fundamental reality of captivity. Everyone breaks eventually under sufficient torture. The human body has limits. When torture exceeds those limits, resistance becomes impossible. The prisoners who survived weren't the ones who never broke. They were the ones who broke later rather than sooner, who resisted as long as physically possible, who forgave themselves for breaking because breaking was inevitable. Life in the Hanoi Hilton. Over the next weeks, I learned the routines of prison life. Woke at 0600 to guard banging on the door. Received 2 meals daily. Thin vegetable soup, small portion of rice, occasionally bread, never enough calories to maintain body weight. Used the waste bucket, which was emptied maybe twice daily, leaving the cell reeking of human waste. Spent 23 hours per day in the cell, with 1 hour for washing and limited exercise in a small courtyard. Communication with other prisoners was forbidden. Guards watched constantly through the door window. Speaking to other prisoners resulted in immediate punishment, beatings, torture, solitary confinement, and even worse conditions. But prisoners developed covert communication systems anyway, because isolation was psychologically devastating and knowing other Americans were nearby made survival possible. The primary communication method was tap code, a system where letters were tapped on cell walls using a 5x5 grid. A equals 11, 1 tap, pause, 1 tap. B equals 12, 1 tap, pause, 2 taps, and so on through the alphabet. Prisoners spent hours each day tapping messages through walls, communicating news, maintaining morale, organizing resistance to interrogation demands. I learned tap code from the prisoner in the adjacent cell, Major William Thompson, an Air Force pilot who'd been captured in 1966 and had 14 months more experience than I did. He taught me the communication system, taught me resistance techniques, taught me how to maintain sanity in conditions designed to break prisoners psychologically. The key is maintaining mental discipline. Thompson tapped through the wall one night. Physical torture you can't control. They'll hurt you until you comply, or until you're physically broken. But mental discipline you can control. Maintain routines. Exercise daily, even in the cell. Memorize poetry or songs. Plan in detail what you'll do when released. Keep your mind active, because if your mind breaks, you won't survive. I followed his advice. Established daily routines. Exercises using my body weight. Walking endless circles in the tiny cell. Mentally reviewing every detail of my life before captivity. Planning in exhaustive detail what I'd do after release. The mental discipline helped. Made the endless, empty hours bearable. Provided structure in an environment designed to be structureless and hopeless. The propaganda sessions. January 1968. The North Vietnamese began using captured American pilots for propaganda purposes. They'd bring reporters, Cuban, Russian, East European journalists sympathetic to North Vietnam, to interview prisoners who'd then be forced to make statements denouncing American policy. I was brought to a propaganda session 1 week after my capture, ordered to sit at a table with a Cuban journalist while cameras filmed the interview. Tell the world about American war crimes. Tell them you regret bombing innocent Vietnamese people. I tried subtle resistance, made statements that sounded cooperative but were actually undermining the propaganda message, spoke in monotone, avoided eye contact, gave answers that would make viewers question whether I was speaking voluntarily. The guards recognized what I was doing. After the session, they beat me savagely, threatened worse torture if I didn't provide more enthusiastic propaganda cooperation in future sessions. But the propaganda attempts also revealed something important. The North Vietnamese needed American prisoners alive and relatively undamaged for propaganda purposes. They couldn't torture us to death or permanently cripple us, because that would undermine their propaganda message that prisoners were being treated humanely. That knowledge provided leverage. We could resist to the point where continued resistance would result in permanent damage, knowing that they'd usually stop before reaching that point. It was a grim calculus, calculating how much torture you could endure before permanent damage occurred, resisting up to that point, but complying before they killed or crippled you. Walking the line between resistance and survival. Auto 2. Survival for long middle years. 1968 became 1969. 1969 became 1970. The days blurred together. Endless repetition of the same routine, the same cell, the same guards, the same thin soup and stale rice. Time lost meaning when every day was identical. I tracked days by scratching marks on the cell wall, but even that became abstract. What difference did it make whether I'd been imprisoned for 400 days or 500 days when there was no indication when captivity would end? The physical conditions were grinding me down. I'd lost 40 pounds from malnutrition, suffered from chronic dysentery that left me weak and dehydrated, had tropical diseases, malaria, infections from untreated wounds, parasites from contaminated food. The guards provided minimal medical care, occasionally antibiotics for life-threatening infections, but nothing for chronic conditions or pain. The psychological toll was worse than the physical damage. Isolation was devastating. Even with tap code communication through walls, the lack of face-to-face human contact, the lack of normal conversation, the endless solitude was breaking down my mental functioning. I experienced symptoms that would later be recognized as psychological trauma from prolonged isolation. Difficulty concentrating, memory problems, dissociation where I'd lose track of time for hours, auditory hallucinations where I'd hear voices that weren't real. Thompson helped me through the worst periods. He'd tap encouragement through the wall, would engage me in long conversations via tap code, would remind me that survival was possible because others had endured even longer periods of captivity. Focus on small victories. He tapped one night after I'd expressed despair about whether I'd ever be released. You survived today. That's a victory. You resisted interrogation as long as possible before complying. That's a victory. You maintained communication despite guards trying to prevent it. That's a victory. Enough small victories accumulate into surviving this. I try to follow his advice. Try to focus on surviving one day at a time, rather than contemplating the impossibility of enduring years more captivity. Some days it worked. Some days it didn't, and I'd spiral into despair so deep I considered suicide as preferable to endless imprisonment. The escape attempt. Spring 1969. Thompson and I, along with 3 other prisoners in adjacent cells, began planning an escape attempt. We knew the odds were almost zero. Hoa Lo Prison was in central Hanoi. We were weakened from malnutrition. We didn't speak Vietnamese. We had no resources and no local contacts. But attempting escape was better than accepting captivity indefinitely. Over months, we used tap code to coordinate the plan. We'd overpower guards during the evening meal when cells were open to receive food. We'd take their weapons and keys. We'd release other prisoners from nearby cells. We'd fight our way to the prison perimeter, scale the wall, escape into Hanoi, attempt to reach the Red River, and follow it south toward possible rescue by American forces. The plan was desperate and almost certainly suicidal. But we were desperate men. And attempting something, even with minimal success probability, was psychologically necessary after years of passive captivity. We set the attempt for May 15th, 1969. Evening mealtime. Thompson's cell was first to receive food. When the guard opened his door, Thompson was supposed to overpower him, take his keys and weapon, release the rest of us. But the attempt failed before it began. The guard was accompanied by 2 additional guards. Unusual, suggesting they'd been warned about possible escape attempts. When Thompson attacked the guard, the other 2 immediately subdued him with overwhelming force. The punishment was severe. Thompson was beaten unconscious, then subjected to the rope torture for extended periods. I was also tortured. The guards assumed I was involved in the escape planning based on my proximity to Thompson's cell. The 3 other prisoners who'd been part of the plan received similar punishment. Thompson was moved to solitary confinement in a punishment cell called the Black Box, a tiny space maybe 4 feet by 4 feet with no light, minimal ventilation, and conditions so horrific that prisoners emerged psychologically broken after weeks in that environment. I didn't see Thompson again for 8 months. When he finally returned to regular cells, he was a shadow of himself, had lost 60 pounds, had severe psychological trauma from months in the black box, barely functioned coherently. But he'd survived, and surviving despite everything the North Vietnamese could inflict was its own form of victory. The turning point. September 1969. The treatment of prisoners began improving slightly, not because the North Vietnamese had developed humanitarian concern, but because of international pressure. The Geneva Convention violations were being documented. Families of prisoners were organizing politically in America, demanding better treatment. The North Vietnamese calculated that slightly improving conditions would benefit them more than continued severe mistreatment. The improvements were modest: slightly better food, reduced torture frequency, occasional letters from home that had been held for months or years before delivery. But even modest improvements felt enormous after years of brutal treatment. I received my first letter from home in September 1969 from my wife Sarah, describing our daughter Emily's third birthday party. Emily had been 6 months old when I was shot down. I'd missed 3 years of her life. The letter was devastating. Made me realize how much time was passing, how much I was losing, how my daughter was growing up without knowing me. But the letter also reinforced why survival mattered. I had a family waiting for me, had a daughter who needed a father, had a life that could resume if I could just endure captivity long enough to be released. I kept that letter in my cell, read it hundreds of times over subsequent months. It became a talisman, physical proof that life existed beyond prison walls, that people loved me, that survival had purpose beyond simply refusing to let the enemy win. The fellow prisoners. By late 1969, I'd been in prison for 2 years. The prison population had grown as more American pilots were shot down. The North Vietnamese began housing prisoners in larger groups, maybe 6 to 8 men per cell, instead of individual isolation. This was partially for their convenience, but it also served their propaganda purposes by allowing them to claim prisoners were receiving humane treatment, including social contact with fellow prisoners. Being housed with other Americans transformed captivity. After 2 years of isolation, broken only by covert tap code communication, having face-to-face contact with fellow prisoners provided psychological relief that's impossible to overstate. I was moved to a cell with 5 other Air Force and Navy pilots: Major Robert Shun, Captain David Morrison, Lieutenant Commander Frank O'Brien, First Lieutenant Timothy Walsh, and Captain Gregory Sanders. They ranged from 6 months to 3 years in captivity, had all experienced similar torture and interrogation, had all developed similar survival strategies. We established routines, daily group exercise sessions using body weight and makeshift equipment, organized classes where each prisoner taught subjects they knew. Morrison was an engineer and taught math and physics. O'Brien had studied history and taught American history lessons. Walsh knew multiple languages and taught basic Spanish and French. We played chess using pieces made from bread and a board scratched on the floor. We told stories about our lives before captivity, shared memories, maintained connection to the world beyond prison. The communal living was life-saving. Individual isolation had been psychologically devastating. Group imprisonment was still terrible. We were still malnourished, still tortured periodically, still had no freedom. But having social contact made endurance psychologically possible in ways that isolation hadn't. We also organized resistance, established group policies about what we'd comply with and what we'd resist, agreed that we'd resist to the point of severe torture, but would comply before permanent physical damage occurred, agreed that no one would be judged for breaking under torture because everyone eventually broke, agreed that we'd support each other psychologically, would maintain morale collectively when individual morale failed. The Christmas bombing. December 1972. After 5 years of captivity, I was no longer the scared, recently captured pilot I'd been in 1967. I was a hardened veteran prisoner who'd survived torture, isolation, disease, and psychological warfare that had killed or permanently broken other prisoners. But December 1972 brought something new. Operation Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombing, 11 days of intensive B-52 bombing campaigns against Hanoi and Haiphong designed to force North Vietnam to negotiate seriously at the Paris peace talks. We heard the bombing from our cells. The B-52s came in waves, night after night, dropping hundreds of tons of high explosives on military targets throughout Hanoi. The bombing was so close we could feel the concussions, could hear the explosions, could see the flashes through the tiny window in our cell. The guard were terrified. They'd never experienced bombing this intense. They moved us to underground shelters during the raids, kept us there for hours while the bombing continued overhead. Some guards suggested that prisoners might be killed by American bombs, that we were being endangered by our own country's military actions. But we prisoners recognized what the bombing meant. America was finally using overwhelming force to compel negotiations. The war that had dragged on for years was entering its final phase. Release might finally be possible. The hope was cautious. We'd been disappointed too many times, had heard rumors of peace negotiations that went nowhere, had experienced periods where release seemed imminent only to have hopes crushed. But the Christmas bombing felt different. Felt like America was committed to ending the war definitively rather than allowing it to continue indefinitely. The peace agreement. January 1973. The guards' demeanor changed. They became less hostile, more professional. Torture stopped completely. Interrogations became rare. Something fundamental had shifted. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accord were signed. The agreement included provisions for prisoner release. All American prisoners of war would be released within 60 days in exchange for American military withdrawal from South Vietnam. We were told officially on January 28th. A senior North Vietnamese officer came to our cell, announced that peace agreement had been signed, that we'd be released in coming weeks. The emotion was overwhelming. 5 years of captivity, 1,847 days of imprisonment, torture, deprivation, psychological warfare. And suddenly it was ending. We'd survived. We'd be going home. But we didn't celebrate immediately. We'd been disappointed before. We believe in release when we were actually on aircraft flying away from North Vietnam. Not before. Auto 3. Liberation to Release Process. February 1973. The prisoner release began in phases. Groups of prisoners flown out weekly based on capture date, with longest-held prisoners released first. I've been captured in December 1967, making me mid-priority for release. I'd be in one of the middle groups, probably released in late February or early March. The waiting was agonizing. Watching other prisoners leave, knowing my turn was coming but not knowing exactly when, hoping nothing would go wrong that might cancel the releases. We'd been prisoners for so long that even with signed peace agreements, part of us couldn't believe freedom was actually possible. The prison administration began processing us for release. Medical examinations to document injuries and health conditions. Interrogations asking us to identify guards who'd tortured us so North Vietnam could claim they were disciplining the guilty parties. Propaganda sessions where they urged us to speak positively about our treatment and to oppose American policy when we returned home. We refused the propaganda requests. After 5 years of forced compliance under torture, having the power to refuse without being tortured was psychologically liberating even before physical release. Departure Day, March 4th, 1973. My release date, 1,847 days after being shot down. 5 years and 27 days of captivity ending. We were transported by bus from Hoa Lo Prison to Gia Lam Airport outside Hanoi. The bus drove through the city. The first time I'd seen Hanoi outside a prison wall since capture. The city looked different than I'd imagined during years of imprisonment. More normal, more alive, less like the enemy capital, and more like a city where people lived regular lives. At the airport, American C-141 transport aircraft waited. American military personnel, the first Americans other than fellow prisoners I'd seen in 5 years, were there to receive us. The moment we crossed from North Vietnamese custody to American custody felt surreal, like crossing from one reality to another, from a nightmare into waking life. I boarded the C-141, found a seat, waited while the aircraft loaded other released prisoners. Finally, the engine started. The aircraft began taxiing, lifted off from the runway, climbed away from North Vietnam. Only when we were at altitude, clearly beyond any possibility of being recalled, did I allow myself to believe it was real. I was free. I'd survived. I was going home. The emotion hit me all at once. 5 years of suppressed feelings. 5 years of maintaining psychological discipline to survive. 5 years of refusing to let myself feel anything deeply because feelings were vulnerability in an environment where vulnerability meant death. All of it released simultaneously. I cried for the first time since capture. Cried from relief, from grief for the years lost, from survivors' guilt about prisoners who died in captivity, from joy at being alive and free. Clark Air Base. We landed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the processing center where released prisoners would receive medical treatment, intelligence debriefing, and preparation for return to America. The medical examinations were extensive. I'd lost 45 pounds from my pre-capture weight of 175 pounds. Had multiple untreated injuries, shoulders damaged from rope torture, ribs that had been broken and healed incorrectly, tropical diseases, intestinal parasites, dental problems from years without dental care, muscle atrophy from malnutrition and lack of exercise. The psychological examination was more concerning. I had severe symptoms of what would later be called PTSD, nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting people, emotional numbing, survivor's guilt, anger at having been abandoned for 5 years while America negotiated. The military psychologist recommended extensive treatment, warned that readjusting to normal life would be extremely difficult after years of captivity. The intelligence debriefing lasted for days. Officers asked detailed questions about prison conditions, torture techniques, propaganda attempts, guard identities, fellow prisoners' status, communication methods, resistance strategies. The information would be used to help other prisoners who might be captured in future conflicts, to document Geneva Convention violations, to improve military training for resisting interrogation. I told them everything. Described the torture in clinical detail. Identified guards who'd been particularly brutal. Documented how prisoners had organized resistance despite isolation and torture. Provided intelligence about North Vietnamese interrogation techniques and psychological warfare strategies. Returning home. March 15, 1973. I flew from the Philippines to Travis Air Force Base in California. Sarah and Emily were there. My wife who'd waited 5 years and my daughter who was now 5 years old and didn't remember me because she'd been 6 months old when I was shot down. The reunion was awkward. Emily was scared of me. I was a stranger claiming to be her father. Sarah was emotional but also cautious. We'd both changed enormously during 5 years of separation. The relationship we'd had in 1967 no longer existed. We'd have to build something new from the foundation of what we'd been before. The following months were extraordinarily difficult. I struggled with PTSD symptoms that made normal family life nearly impossible. Had nightmares every night about torture and imprisonment. Couldn't be in enclosed spaces without experiencing panic attacks. Had hypervigilance that made me constantly scan for threats, even in safe environments. Had anger issues that erupted over minor frustrations. Had difficulty connecting emotionally with Sarah and Emily because 5 years of emotional suppression had damaged my ability to feel and express feelings appropriately. Sarah struggled too. She'd spent 5 years as effectively a single mother, not knowing whether I was alive, building a life that didn't include me. My return disrupted that life. She had to readjust to having a husband who was psychologically damaged and struggling to function normally. Emily had no memory of me and didn't understand why this strange man was now living in our house and claiming to be her father. Building a relationship with her took years of patient effort, slowly earning her trust, gradually becoming more than a stranger. The long recovery. Recovery from 5 years as a POW took decades, not months. The physical injuries healed over time. I regained the weight I'd lost. The diseases were treated. The broken bones that had healed incorrectly were surgically repaired when possible. The psychological damage was permanent. PTSD doesn't heal, it gets managed. I received treatment through military mental health programs, eventually civilian therapy when I retired from active duty. The treatment helped, gave me tools to manage symptoms, to understand why I experienced certain reactions, to function despite psychological damage. But I never fully recovered the person I'd been before captivity. 5 years of torture and psychological warfare had fundamentally changed me. I was harder, more emotionally guarded, less trusting, more aware of human capacity for cruelty. The optimistic young pilot who'd volunteered for Vietnam in 1967 was gone. replaced by someone who'd seen darkness and carried it forever. My relationship with Sarah survived, but required enormous effort from both of us. We did marriage counseling for years, slowly rebuilding trust and connection, learning to be partners again after 5 years of separation. Emily eventually accepted me as her father, though our relationship was always complicated by the years I'd missed in early childhood. I stayed in the Air Force, eventually retired as a colonel in 1987 after 26 years of service. I flew again, had to prove to myself that being shot down hadn't destroyed my ability to fly, but never deployed to combat again. I worked mostly desk jobs training other pilots and developing tactics. Reunions with fellow prisoners. Over subsequent years, I maintained contact with other POWs who'd been imprisoned at the Hanoi Hilton. We had reunions annually, would share stories, would support each other through ongoing struggles with PTSD and readjustment to civilian life. Those relationships were the strongest bonds I'd ever experienced. Stronger than military unit bonds, stronger than most family relationships, because we'd survived together circumstances that would have destroyed us individually. Thompson, the major who taught me TAP code and survival strategies, became a lifelong friend. We talked regularly for decades, supported each other through the difficult times, celebrated successes. He died in 2003 from cancer that might have been caused by the horrific conditions we'd endured in prison. I spoke at his funeral, talked about how he'd kept me alive during the darkest periods of captivity, how I owed my survival to his mentorship and support. Of the approximately 600 American POWs released in 1973, dozens died from complications related to their imprisonment, cancers from untreated tropical diseases, suicide from untreated PTSD, organ failures from malnutrition damage. We'd survived captivity, but many didn't survive the aftermath. The prison had damaged us in ways that killed us years later, even after we'd returned home. Reflection on captivity. I'm 79 years old now. The shoot-down was 56 years ago. The captivity ended 52 years ago. But I remember every detail: the sound of the S-2 alarm, the impact of the missile, the descent through the air under parachute, the first moments of captivity, every day of the 1,847 days I was imprisoned, the moment of release. Captivity taught me things about human endurance and human cruelty that I wish I hadn't learned. Taught me that everyone breaks under sufficient torture, that survival sometimes requires complying with demands you morally oppose, that maintaining psychological discipline is more important than physical resistance when physical resistance becomes impossible. Captivity also taught me about brotherhood and mutual support. The prisoners who survived weren't necessarily the toughest individuals. They were the ones who supported each other, who used communication systems to maintain morale, who organized collective resistance that distributed the psychological burden across many men rather than concentrating it on individuals. I don't regret serving. Don't regret volunteering for Vietnam. Don't regret the missions I flew before being shot down. I was doing my duty as I understood it, serving my country in a war that my government had committed to fighting. But I carry the cost. The 5 years lost. The psychological damage. The ongoing PTSD symptoms that affect me decades later. The knowledge of what human beings are capable of inflicting on other human beings when given power and permission to torture. The POW experience was the defining event of my life. Everything before it led to it. Everything after was shaped by it. The person I am now was forged in that crucible of 1,847 days as a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. Message to others. For military personnel who might face capture in future conflicts. Resistance is possible, but has limits. Follow the code of conduct as long as you can, but forgive yourself when you break, because everyone breaks eventually. Focus on survival rather than heroic resistance that gets you killed. Maintain mental discipline through routines and structure. Communicate with fellow prisoners however possible, because isolation is more psychologically damaging than physical torture. Remember that surviving captivity is itself victory. Every day you survive denies the enemy the victory of destroying you. For families of prisoners, your support matters more than you know. Letters from home, knowledge that people are working for your release, belief that you haven't been forgotten. These things sustain prisoners through conditions that would otherwise be psychologically impossible. Sarah's letters, even though I received them months late and heavily censored, were lifelines that reminded me why survival mattered. For anyone who hasn't experienced captivity, understand that prisoners of war carry invisible wounds that last lifetimes. The physical imprisonment ends when they're released, but the psychological imprisonment continues indefinitely. Support veterans struggling with PTSD from captivity experiences. Understand that their struggles are legitimate consequences of serving their country in the worst possible circumstances. Final testimony. I am Captain James Robert Patterson, U.S. Air Force, retired. I was shot down over North Vietnam on December 18, 1967. I was held as a prisoner of war for 1,847 days, 5 years and 27 days. I was tortured, starved, isolated, and subjected to psychological warfare designed to break me. But I survived. I came home. I built a life after captivity despite psychological damage that affected everything that came after. I'm still here, 52 years after release, still carrying the weight of those 1,847 days, but still standing. This is my testimony. This is what it meant to be a prisoner of war in North Vietnam. This is the story of 1,847 days of captivity, torture, survival, and eventual liberation. This is the price prisoners pay for serving their country in wars where capture means years of suffering under conditions that violate every principle of humane treatment. May the prisoners who died in captivity, who endured torture until it killed them, who took their own lives rather than continue suffering, who never came home, be remembered and honored. May their families find some measure of peace, knowing their loved ones were warriors who fought until they couldn't fight anymore. May those who survived captivity be supported in their ongoing struggles with the aftermath. May they receive the treatment, respect, and understanding they deserve for sacrificing years of their lives and their psychological well-being in service to their country. This is the truth about being a prisoner of war. About 1,847 days in hell. About survival through torture and isolation. About coming home, but never fully leaving the prison behind. I survived. That's my story. That's what it cost. That's what it means to be a prisoner of war who lived to tell the tale.